princess and just got handed one of the most powerful titles in the British monarchy, and the way it happened tells you everything about where this royal family actually stands right now. No press conference, no official announcement, no carefully worded statement from the palace communications team. Music. Just a late-night meeting, sealed documents, and a king who apparently decided that certain things needed to be locked down before anyone outside those walls found out. And the more you look at what actually went down, the more it becomes clear that this was never just about a title. There was a reason for the timing, a reason for the secrecy, and a reason why Princess, and specifically, was the one walking out of that room with something the monarchy had not handed to anyone in a very long time. Let's talk about what we actually know. According to sources familiar with how the palace operates, King Charles called and in for a private audience that was not on any official schedule. And that alone should tell you how unusual this was. Buckingham Palace runs on structure. Every engagement is logged, coordinated, briefed through layers of staff, and communicated with the kind of precision that makes government offices look disorganized by comparison. Music. So, when a meeting like this happens completely off the books, with senior aides reportedly cleared from the hallway before it began, that is not an administrative oversight. That is, music, a deliberate decision to keep something quiet. The people who described the atmosphere inside the palace that night said Charles looked exhausted but completely resolved, not uncertain, not hesitant. Exhausted and resolved, which is actually a very specific kind of energy that only shows up, music, when someone has been sitting with a difficult decision for a long time and has finally stopped debating it with themselves. Whatever was in that document, he had already made up his mind well before and walked through the door. Now, to really understand why this moment hit the way it did, you have to understand who and actually is within this family, because she is genuinely unlike anyone else in the royal circle. While the rest of the monarchy has spent years managing image crises, Sussex drama, and the constant pressure of public opinion, and has essentially been doing the same thing she has always done, which is show up, do the work, and not particularly care whether anyone is watching. In 2023, she carried out 457 royal engagements, more than Charles himself. She has been doing this since she was a teenager, and she has never really stopped. People sometimes describe the British monarchy as an institution built on appearances, music, and for a lot of its members, that is honestly a fair criticism. And as the exception, her reputation is built on actual output, and the family knows it. The bond between Anne and Charles is also worth understanding here because it goes a lot deeper than sibling loyalty. They grew up just 2 years apart, and with their parents constantly traveling for royal duties, the two of them leaned on each other in a way that shaped the relationship they still have today. Music. That closeness has never really faded, and is famously one of the only people in Charles's inner circle who will tell him the truth even when he does not want to hear it. Music. She gives him her actual opinion, pushes back when she disagrees, and he genuinely values that, which is rare for someone in his position. Music. The gold stick in waiting title he gave her during his coronation was widely read as a ceremonial gesture, but people who understand how Charles thinks saw it differently. That was him putting his trust on public record. The Princess Royal Regent designation takes that trust to an entirely different level. And then there, music, is Sir Timothy Lawrence, who has quietly become a bigger piece of the story, music, than most people realize. Timothy has spent roughly 30 years being almost entirely invisible by royal music standards. He is Anne's husband, a former naval officer, polite and composed in every public setting, music, and almost never in a headline. In a family where even minor figures attract constant music media attention, that level of discretion is not accidental. It is a conscious choice, and it has defined his entire position, music, within the household. He has never held an official royal role. He received, music, no princely title when he married Anne. He has essentially spent 3 decades standing 2 steps behind the woman he married and doing it without complaint. When Charles recently elevated him to Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, the highest rank available within that honor system, people who follow royal appointments closely, music, noticed immediately, not because of what the title means on paper, but music, because of who gives it and why. The Royal Victorian Order is entirely the monarch's personal gift. Music. It does not go through government channels, or committees. It is a direct expression, music, of gratitude from the sovereign himself, which means Charles chose this deliberately at this particular moment. The circle of people who hold that rank, music, includes Queen Camilla, Catherine, and the Duchess of Edinburgh. For Timothy to now sit symbolically alongside those names signals something. It does not make him a working royal. It does not give him constitutional authority. But in the language of monarchy, where every gesture carries weight and every music ribbon means something, this one reads, as acknowledgement, the man who never asked for anything is being told quietly that his loyalty has been seen. Music. And that timing matters more than it might seem at first glance because the working royal lineup right now is thinner than it has been in decades. Music. Charles is managing his health publicly. Catherine has been largely away from public duties doing her recovery. Harry and Andrew are both gone from active royal life. The people left carrying the daily weight of the institution, music, are a much smaller group than even 5 years ago, and sits at the center of that group. So, what Charles is essentially doing between the regent title and Timothy's elevation is reinforcing music, the people who are actually holding things together. What makes all of this even more layered is the personal history running underneath it because and the people now surrounding the throne have a backstory that goes back decades. And it is music, genuinely one of the more complicated webs in modern royal history. Before Camilla Parker Bowles became queen consort, before she was the woman Charles finally got to marry after everything they went through to get there, she was married to a man named Andrew Parker, music Bowles. And Andrew Parker Bowles, before any of that, had a romantic history with Princess Anne. In the early 1970s, Anne and Andrew were genuinely connected. People in royal circles at the time described it as a real relationship, not just a casual acquaintance, but it did not last. Music. And the reason it ended was not scandal or family intervention in any dramatic sense. Music. It ended because Andrew was Catholic, and at the time royal tradition made that kind of union essentially impossible for a Protestant music princess. So, they went their separate ways. Andrew eventually reconnected with Camilla Shand, a woman he had known before, and in 1973 they married. Meanwhile, Charles had already fallen for Camilla himself hard before royal duty and the pressure of the crown pushed them apart. Camilla married Andrew. Charles eventually married Diana, and in for her part married music Olympic equestrian Mark Phillips that same year. For people all tangled up in the same emotional history, each ending up somewhere completely different from where their hearts were pointing in the beginning. That history never fully disappeared. It got buried under decades of royal events, music, public appearances, and carefully managed narratives, but it did not disappear. And when Charles and Camilla finally made it official in 2005, after Diana's death and years of public scrutiny and complicated feelings across the entire family, and handled it the way she handles most things, music, quietly, professionally, and without making a public scene. She did not give interviews. She did not do anything that could be clipped music into a headline. But people who were paying attention noticed that she was not exactly radiating warmth about the situation either. The tension was not loud, it was just present. Part of what drove that tension was philosophical as much as personal, and has always operated on a music-specific set of values around what royal life actually means. To her, the title comes with a responsibility that is non-negotiable. You show up, you work, you serve, and you do not ask for recognition in return. That is the deal. Camilla's path into the royal family looked very different from that framework. Her entrance was not through decades of quiet service. It was through a relationship that had been publicly controversial for years, followed by a gradual and sometimes uncomfortable rehabilitation of her image, and respected the effort Camilla made, music, in the way that you can respect someone's work without ever fully closing the emotional distance between you. The curtsy moment that royal watchers flagged after Camilla became queen consort was small in the grand scheme of things, but it got a lot of attention precisely because it said so much without saying anything. Music, and did not curtsy. Whether that was a statement or simply a reflection of their complicated shared history is something only Anne knows, but either way, it landed. What is interesting is that despite all of this, Anne has never let her personal feelings, music, interfere with her public function. That is actually one of the things that makes her so uniquely suited to the role Charles has now handed her. She can disagree with something, feel something privately, and still walk into a room and perform her duties without letting any of it show in a way that creates problems for the institution. That is a skill that sounds simple and is genuinely rare. Charles trusts her not just because she is loyal, but because she is disciplined in a way that goes beyond just following rules. She understands the stakes of the institution itself, and she has made a lifetime commitment to protecting it even when that commitment is personally costly. The internal dynamic between and Camilla has never been a war. It is more like two people who occupy the same space, music, with very different histories and very different philosophies, and who have both made the calculation that the institution, music, matters more than whatever friction exists between them. In public, they are composed, polite, and functional. Music. Behind closed doors, by most accounts, the relationship is more complicated but also more managed than the tabloids tend to suggest. There is no ongoing feud, though active power struggle. There is just a quiet acknowledgement on both sides that they are very different people who serve the same crown, and that the crown comes first. Camilla's journey to acceptance has genuinely not been easy, and it would be unfair to pretend otherwise. Music. When she stepped into public life as Charles's partner and eventually his wife, a significant portion of the British public was not ready to accept her. The shadow of Diana loomed over everything. The years of difficult headlines, the perception that she had been a disruptive force in what many people saw as a fairy tale marriage, all of that followed her into her new role. She has spent years doing steady, consistent charity work, building relationships with organizations, music, showing up for causes that do not generate a lot of press attention, and gradually shifting the public narrative around who she is. It has worked to a meaningful degree. Her approval numbers are higher now than they were a decade ago. But full acceptance, the kind that comes without any asterisk attached, has remained elusive in certain corners. What the palace seems to understand now, perhaps more clearly than before, is that the path forward for this monarchy is not going to be built on perfection or on resolving every complicated dynamic from the past. It is going to be built on whoever is actually showing up and doing the work. And on that measure, the current picture is, and at the center, Timothy quietly elevated and acknowledged, Camilla steadily building her record, music, and Charles managing his health while trying to stabilize an institution that has had a genuinely difficult few years. The Princess Royal Regent title is the most visible piece of that picture, music, but it is not the only piece. The documentary that the BBC aired on Boxing Day 2023 gave the public a rare look at what the transition into this new reign actually felt like from the inside, and it was more human than most people expected. Charles III. The coronation year followed Charles and Camilla through their first year as monarchs. Music. From the period immediately after Queen Elizabeth's death through the coronation, music, and into the quieter months that followed. Robert Hardman wrote it. Helena Bonham Carter narrated it, and the overall tone was warm without being saccharine. What made it interesting was not the ceremony footage, which everyone had already seen, but music, the smaller moments that slipped through. Charles and Camilla laughing with their team during rehearsals, the Archbishop of Canterbury forgetting a line from a prayer, music, and everyone in the room visibly trying not to react. Prince William teasing his father about his hands while Charles struggled with his ceremonial robe. These are not the kinds of moments that get staged for a camera. They are the kinds of moments that happen, music, when people are genuinely comfortable with each other and have temporarily forgotten they are being filmed. Anne's contribution to the documentary was one of the more emotionally honest sequences in the whole film. She talked about watching the crown being removed from her mother's coffin during the funeral, music, and described feeling a deep sense of relief in that moment. Not grief specifically, though the grief was obviously there. Relief, the sense that her mother's long years of duty had finally been music, allowed to end. She also revealed that Queen Elizabeth had worried about dying at Balmoral, concerned that it would create logistical, music, difficulties for everyone around her, and said she had tried to reassure her mother that she should not let that kind of thinking, music, influence her decisions about where she spent her time. That is such a specific and telling detail. Even in her final chapter, The queen was thinking about the inconvenience her death might cause other people. Music, and, true to form, was the one, telling her to stop. The documentary received mostly positive reviews, but also nearly 900 complaints to the BBC. Music, after it aired, with many viewers arguing it was more of a public relations exercise than a genuine piece of journalism. That criticism is not entirely unfair. Music. The film made no mention of Harry, no mention of Andrew, no reference to the coronation protests, and nothing that could be described as critical of the royal family in any meaningful way. Graham Smith from the anti-monarchy group Republic called it a PR film dressed up as history, music, which is a pretty accurate description of what it was. But that does not mean it was without value. What it captured, even within its obvious constraints, was a family trying to find its footing, music, after an enormous loss, while simultaneously performing one of the most scrutinized public events in recent British music history. The nerves were real, the humor was real, the exhaustion was real, and for viewers who were willing to watch it on those terms rather than as investigative journalism, it offered something genuine. The picture that emerges from all of this, from the Regent title to Timothy's elevation to the documentary to everything that has played out publicly over the past 2 years, music, is of a monarchy in active transition that is leaning very hard on a small group of people to hold the center. Charles is leading that transition while managing a cancer diagnosis that he has handled with more openness than any previous British monarch would have considered. Music. Catherine has been navigating her own health situation with a similar kind of public honesty that felt genuinely new for this family, and it has been doing what it always does, which is absorbing whatever is required of her and delivering it without commentary. The Princess Royal Regent designation is significant not just because of what it allows and to do constitutionally, but because of what it communicates about the state of the institution. A monarch does not reach for that title unless there is a real possibility it will be needed. Charles is not being dramatic or overly cautious by putting this in place. He is being practical, which is actually one of the more reassuring things about how he has approached music this reign so far. He is not pretending everything is fine. He is not performing strength he does not have. Music. He is making structural decisions that protect the institution in his absence, if absence becomes necessary, and he is doing it by placing that responsibility in the hands of the person he trusts most completely, and has earned that trust across a lifetime of service that most people in her position would not have sustained. She competed, music, in the 1976 Montreal Olympics as an equestrian, becoming the first British royal to compete at that level. She survived a kidnapping attempt in 1974, music, and reportedly told her attacker, in her exact words, "Not bloody likely," which, honestly, tells you everything you need to know about her. She raised her children, Peter and Zara, without royal titles so they could have something closer to a normal life. She has shown up for causes that do not generate headlines and engagements that do not come with cameras year after year without needing any of it to be noticed. The gold stick in waiting at the coronation was Charles publicly saying he sees all of that. The music Regent title is him saying he is counting on it. What this family looks like right now is smaller, more strained, and more dependent on fewer people than it has been at any point in recent memory. But it is also in some ways more honest about what it actually is than it has been in a long time. The gap between the public image and the private reality has narrowed not because the palace has suddenly become transparent, but because the circumstances have forced the kind of authenticity, music, that image management alone cannot sustain. When a king is dealing with cancer and still showing up, when his daughter-in-law is navigating a serious illness publicly, when his most trusted sibling is being handed emergency powers in a midnight signing, the performance of effortless stability becomes impossible to maintain. And maybe that is not entirely a bad thing. Music. The monarchy's long-term survival has always depended less on appearing perfect, music, and more on appearing relevant. Right now, for better or worse, music. It is impossible to call this family irrelevant. Whether that is enough to carry them through what comes next is the question that nobody inside those palace walls can answer.